The crisp, dry scent of aged paper usually brought Marcus a quiet satisfaction, a palpable connection to forgotten eras. His small study, meticulously organized, was a fortress against the unpredictable clamor of the outside world. Here, amidst stacks of meticulously catalogued texts and the soft hum of his desktop computer, he felt in control. Marcus, a historian by trade and temperament, valued fact over fiction, evidence over anecdote. He considered superstition a cultural relic, fascinating in its persistence, but ultimately a symptom of unexamined fears. This quiet order was disrupted by a formal letter, its heavy cream stock and embossed seal an immediate anomaly among his usual academic correspondence. It spoke of an inheritance, a distant relative he barely recalled, and a property named Blackwood Manor. Marcus had initially dismissed it as a clerical error, a misplaced legacy, but a subsequent call from a solicitor, a precise voice belonging to a man named Gregory, confirmed the improbable truth. Marcus was the sole beneficiary of an estate nestled deep in a region renowned for its isolation and its folklore. "The manor has a reputation, Mr. Thorne," Gregory had stated, his voice dropping slightly, as if sharing a confidence. "Locals speak of peculiarities." Marcus had merely grunted, a dismissive sound that conveyed his academic disinterest in anything beyond verifiable historical record. Peculiarities were often just poor drainage or creaking floorboards. He saw only a potential asset, a large, old structure that would undoubtedly require significant investment, but might, in the long term, offer a return. The drive was long, stretching beyond the familiar gray ribbon of the motorway into a labyrinth of narrow, winding lanes. The landscape shifted subtly, then dramatically. Houses thinned, replaced by dense, ancient woodlands that pressed close to the asphalt, their branches intertwining overhead to form a perpetual twilight. The air grew cooler, heavier, carrying the damp, earthy smell of moss and decaying leaves. The sky, a uniform slate gray, seemed to lower with each mile. He passed a derelict structure, its marquee sign long since fallen, proclaiming nothing but rusted metal. An old cinema, its entrance boarded, its glory faded to a skeletal memory. It was a stark contrast to the lively, if dust-choked, archive of film reels he'd once spent weeks sifting through for a project on early 20th century social habits. Here there was no echo of laughter or whispered secrets, only the profound silence of desolation. The turnoff for Blackwood Manor was unmarked, a barely visible track choked with nettles and wild brambles. His estate vehicle, a practical, unglamorous sedan, crunched over loose gravel and fallen twigs. The trees here were older, gnarled and hunched like ancient sentinels, their boughs heavy with lichen. Ahead, through a gap in the dense foliage, the manor appeared, sudden and imposing. It was not merely large, it was monolithic, a hulking silhouette of dark, weathered stone, its gabled roofs clawing at the low sky. Generations of grime clung to its facade, blurring the distinctions between crumbling mortar and ancient rock. Many of the windows were shuttered or boarded, others stared out like vacant eyes, reflecting only the dull light of the afternoon. A massive iron gate, rusted hinges groaning a barely audible protest, stood ajar as if perpetually waiting for an arrival or a departure that never fully occurred. No birdsong, only the rustle of wind through the skeletal branches and a faint, distant soughing that could have been the sea or merely the house itself breathing. The air was thick, carrying the smell of wet earth, stagnant water, and something else, a dry, musty aroma of extreme age, like a tomb opened after centuries. He walked towards the heavy oak front door, its surface scarred and pitted, the black paint flaking in places to reveal raw, gray wood beneath. The brass knocker, shaped like a gargoyle's head, was green with verdigris. Marcus reached for it, then hesitated, his hand hovering. He pushed instead, and the door, surprisingly, swung inward with a low, drawn-out groan that seemed to resonate through the very foundations of the house. A grand hall stretched before him, its ceiling lost in gloom, its walls lined with faded tapestries that depicted hunting scenes, now indistinct blurs of thread and dust. A massive, cobweb-draped chandelier hung motionless overhead. It smelled of dust, mildew, and an indescribable metallic tang that made his sinuses ache. Marcus took a deep breath, pushing down a nascent prickle of unease. This was merely a very old, very neglected building. His historian's mind immediately sought to categorize, to analyze the decay, to estimate the structural integrity. He was a man of logic, of reason. He had come here to strip away the myth, to uncover the facts, to understand the tangible history of this place. The local legends were just that, stories. He would approach this with the same methodical rigor he applied to any archival research. The vastness of the hall seemed to swallow the sound. A profound sense of isolation isolation descended upon him, not merely the absence of other people, but an intrinsic quality of the house itself. It felt less like an empty dwelling and more like a dormant entity, vast and unblinking, now slowly rousing to his presence. He was here to catalog, to record, to demystify. He was determined. The manor's air hung heavy with the scent of dust and damp stone, a pervasive mustiness that clung to Marcus's clothes. He had chosen the library, a vast chamber dominated by towering, empty bookshelves and a fireplace large enough to stand inside. Its high, arched windows offered a view of the overgrown grounds, a tangled wilderness that seemed to press in on the structure. His determination, a rigid internal mechanism, propelled him forward. This was not merely a house, it was a repository of history, a project. He began the arduous task of unpacking box after heavy box. His research materials, meticulously organized across decades, represented the sum of his professional life. The first cartons held his 18th century land deeds, followed by correspondence from the 19th. He stacked them methodically near a long oak table, clearing a space for his laptop and various archival tools. The silence of the manor was profound, broken only by the rustle of packing paper and the creak of old floorboards under his weight. A sudden, sharp drop in temperature prickled the skin on his forearms. Marcus paused, his hand hovering over a box labeled Local Parish Records. He looked around the vast room. No open windows, no obvious drafts. He attributed it to the sheer volume of old stone and natural thermal sink. A large, ancient building, he reasoned, would have inconsistent temperatures. He resumed his work, dismissing the sensation as an inevitable aspect of inhabiting such a structure. Hours bled into one another. He wrestled with a particularly stubborn bookshelf, attempting to realign its warped timber. As he grunted with effort, a sound like dry leaves skittering across a flagstone floor seemed to emanate from the far end of the room. He straightened, listening intently. Nothing. The sound did not repeat. He considered the possibilities. A mouse, the wind finding a loose pane, the settling of the house itself. Marcus had always found such explanations satisfying in their mundane practicality. The manor was old. Old things made noises. He organized his collection of maps carefully, enrolling brittle parchment into the oak table. He remembered placing his magnifying glass directly beside his compass, a habit ingrained from years of field research. He stared at it, a flicker of irritation rising. Had he been so distracted? He prided himself on his precision, his orderly mind. It must have been an unconscious movement, a momentary lapse. He picked up the glass, returning it to its proper place, a faint frown creasing his brow. As dusk began to seep through the tall window, casting long, distorted shadows, Marcus unearthed a small, iron-bound chest from one of the last remaining boxes. It wasn't part of his usual collection. He had no memory of packing it. Inside, nestled amongst moth-eaten velvet, lay a collection of thin, leather-bound journals, their pages yellowed and brittle. They were handwritten. The script faded in places, but undeniably elegant. The first journal bore the name Eleanor Vance, 1878. Marcus's historian's instinct immediately sharpened. Eleanor Vance was a name he recognized, a distant ancestor who had owned the manor during a particularly turbulent period. He opened the first page, the paper crackling faintly. August 12, 1878. The quiet here has begun to hum. It is not the wind, nor the house settling, but something deeper. My memories, once so clear, now fray at the edges like old lace. I misplaced my spectacles again today, only to find them upon the mantelpiece, where I distinctly recall placing them on my desk. A small thing, yet it disquiets me. Marcus read the entry again. Misplaced objects. He felt a faint tremor of unease, swiftly suppressed. Elderly individuals isolated in large houses often experienced such minor confusions. He turned to another entry, further into the journal. September 3rd, 1878. I find myself forgetting simple things. The names of servants, the purpose of a particular room. The gardener spoke of the old cinema in the village today, a place I remember visiting with such fondness, yet I could not for the life of me recall its name until he uttered it. It is as if the very air saps the clarity from my mind. The old cinema. Marcus recalled a faded photograph in a local history archive depicting a grand, if slightly decaying, structure. He had researched it briefly, noting its eventual conversion into a warehouse. The detail anchored the journal in verifiable history, yet the content remained unsettling. He picked up a second journal, this one from a later date, 1923, penned by a Thomas Blackwood. March 1st, 1923. Not words, precisely, but an echo of what was, what might be. I find myself drawn to the library, Yet when I arrive, I forget why I came. My research, once my solace, now feels like a foreign language. He knew the typical patterns of age-related cognitive decline, the early signs of dementia. These entries, however, spoke with a clarity of distress that transcended mere forgetfulness. They hinted at a conscious awareness of the decline, a struggle against an invisible current. He closed the journal, the leather cool against his fingertips. His rational mind scrambled for explanations. Lead poisoning from old pipes, a shared familial predisposition to mental illness, perhaps even a local folklore tradition of dramatic, exaggerated diary entries. Yet, the coincidence of their experiences, the subtle, insidious nature of their struggles gnawed at the edges of his academic composure. Marcus read the fatal entries in the fragile journal, the ink bleeding slightly at the edges of the aging paper. The chilling implication of a conscious awareness of decline, of something more than just the brain's slow decay, gnawed at him. He set the book down on the mahogany desk, the heavy thud echoing in the cavernous study. His stomach remained a tight, cold knot. As a historian, he prided himself on objectivity, on the meticulous parsing of facts from folklore. That night, sleep offered little respite. He heard it first as a faint rustling, like dry leaves skittering across a distant floorboard. He dismissed it as a draft, an old house finding its voice. Then, a low murmur, indistinct, seemed to coil from the very walls of his bedroom. It was too soft to discern words, a breathy, formless sound that seemed to shift its origin from one corner to the next. He sat upright, listening, his jaw clenched. Nothing, only the steady ticking of the grandfather clock from the hall below. He lay back down, his mind racing, attributing the phenomenon to an overactive imagination, a byproduct of his recent unsettling discoveries. But the sounds persisted. Over the next few days, they grew bolder, yet never concrete enough for definitive identification. A distinct click from an empty room, a faint, almost musical hum that ceased the moment he focused on it. He found himself constantly pausing, head cocked, straining to catch the elusive notes. Peripheral vision became a tormentor. Each time he snapped his head around, nothing remained but the familiar, dust-moted air. His eyes felt gritty from the constant vigilance. His temples throbbed. The nights became a landscape of vivid, consuming nightmares. He dreamt of being trapped within the manor's stone heart, the walls pressing in, alive, breathing. The scent of damp earth and something acrid, metallic, would cling to the air around him, though he knew it was merely a phantom scent from the dream. Driven by a growing unease that transcended mere academic curiosity, Marcus immersed himself in the manor's history. He spent days in the dusty, neglected archive room, poring over brittle ledgers, faded correspondence, and local newspaper clippings. The sheer volume of documentation was staggering, a testament to generations of meticulous record-keeping. He cross-referenced names, dates, and familial lines. The first instance he noted was a Lord Ainsworth, whose journals, dated to the late 17th century, documented a slow descent into what was described by his contemporary as melancholy and fantastical visions, culminating in his abrupt disappearance. A later entry in a parish record simply stated, presumed departed from this earthly realm, no body found. Then, a Mistress Elena Finch, before he was found drowned in the manor's well, ruled a suicide. Marcus meticulously charted these incidents. The pattern repeated itself with unnerving regularity. A master Percival Thorne in the 19th century, known for his rigorous scientific mind, began to write increasingly erratic treatises on the sentient stone and the breathing edifice before being discovered having taken his own life in the library. The last public record of her was a brief mention in a local gazette, noting her family's distress in a search that extended as far as the old cinema on the edge of town, but yielded no trace. Each incident, Marcus noted with a growing sense of horror, involved individuals who had spent prolonged periods in isolation within the manor. Each narrative spoke of a gradual erosion of sanity, culminating in disappearance or self-inflicted death. His clinical historian's mind struggled to find rational connections. Was it a specific familial strain of mental illness, a localized toxic gas? Yet, the descriptions of their experiences, the visions, the sounds, the sentient stone, echoed with a horrifying consistency that defied simple explanation. He pushed away from the desk, his chair scraping loudly on the wooden floor. The sound was swallowed instantly by the vast quiet of the room, leaving only a faint echo. He stood, his gaze sweeping the ornate bookshelves, the towering fireplace, the heavy velvet drapes. The mat was not merely old, not merely isolated. It was a crucible, and he, Marcus, was now inside it, alone. His own name. Marcus traced the faint, almost invisible watermark on the desk's polished surface. The journal lay open, its final passages accusing him with their stark, unembellished fear. Conscious awareness awareness of decline. The phrase lodged itself in his mind, a burr under the skin of his rational intellect. He was a historian, a man of facts and verifiable records, not a collector of ghost stories. Yet, the old paper, the meticulous script, the sheer, undeniable exhaustion etched into the words, spoke of something beyond mere senility. It spoke of a deliberate erosion, a consumption. He pushed the journal away, its weight suddenly oppressive. The study, usually a bastion of quiet contemplation, felt different tonight. The air, once merely still, now seemed to possess a subtle, almost imperceptible hum, like a distant, low-frequency current. He attributed it to the old wiring, the creaking timbers, the general decay of an ancient structure. But his skin prickled. A faint, sweet scent like dried roses and dust wafted from the hallway. It was not unpleasant, but it was out of place. He had aired the house thoroughly. He rose, compelled by a nascent unease, and walked to the study door. The hallway stretched, a long tunnel of shadow punctuated by the dim glow of the single bulb he had installed. He saw nothing. He heard nothing but the faint rasp of his own breath. He returned to the desk, dismissing the sensory anomalies as products of an overactive imagination, fueled by the journal's unsettling narrative. He needed a distraction. Something concrete. He decided to explore the house's less documented areas to find some architectural detail, some structural anomaly that could ground him. He pushed open a heavy, unadorned door. The room beyond was vast, the air thick with the smell of aged velvet and forgotten popcorn. Tiered rows of dusty, moth-eaten seats faced a wide, stained screen. An old projector, a monstrous metal contraption, stood silent in a booth at the rear. This was the old cinema, a relic of some forgotten owner's eccentric hobby. Not from the door, nor from the narrow windows. It emanated from the screen itself, a brief, phosphorescent glow. He blinked, attributing it to dust motes catching the faint light from the hallway. But then it happened again. A series of rapid-fire images, like a broken film reel, flashed across the screen. Not projected, but imprinted. Her eyes, wide and pleading, were fixed on something just beyond his sight. Then a man, his face contorted in a silent scream, clutching his head, his mouth agape. The images were fleeting, less than a second each, yet intensely vivid, burned into his retina. The air in the old cinema grew heavy, pressing against him. The sweet, cloying smell of dried roses intensified, mixed now with a metallic tang he couldn't quite place. His rational mind screamed for an explanation: dust, faulty wiring, optical illusion. But the images were too sharp, too detailed. They were not mere reflections. A new sensation began to creep over him, a subtle but insistent pull. It was not physical, not like a rope, but an internal drawing, a slow, gentle siphon. It was a profoundly invasive feeling, as if his mind was no longer entirely his own, but a transparency through which another entity could peer. His carefully constructed skepticism, his lifelong dedication to logical deduction, began to fracture. The hum in the house, the impossible visions, the pervasive sense of being observed and subtly drained, they coalesced into a single terrifying truth. The journal's final entries had not been the ramblings of a dying mind. They had been a warning. The house was not merely haunted. It was aware, and it was hungry. Marcus backed away slowly, his gaze fixed on the screen, which now showed only the faint, stained surface, but felt charged with unseen energy. He felt himself shrinking, felt his own presence dimming, as if the house was asserting its own colossal consciousness, slowly overshadowing his own. He was an intruder, Emile. He was not merely studying the house's history, he was becoming part of it. The journal's final entry, conscious awareness of decline, continued to resonate within Marcus, a discordant note in the symphony of his intellect. He reread the stark, unembellished fear etched into the old paper, his fingers tracing the faint watermark on the desk. It was an accusation, a warning. His skepticism, usually a formidable shield, felt less robust, a cracked pane letting in a chilling draft. He pushed away from the desk, the heavy chair scraping against the bare floorboards, its sound amplified in the oppressive quiet of the study. He needed to contact someone, a colleague, perhaps, an academic acquaintance who might appreciate the historical significance of his findings, or at least offer a detached, rational perspective on his increasingly unsettling experiences. He retrieved his mobile phone from his coat pocket, its sleek, modern form feeling incongruous in the ancient room. He scrolled through his contacts, his thumb hovering over a name. Dr. Alastair Finch, a fellow historian, known for his dry wit and even drier empiricism. Marcus pressed the call button. No signal. He tried again, moving closer to the leaded window, then to the door, and finally, into the hallway. He walked the length of the hall, then into the vast, echoing foyer, holding the device aloft like an offering. Nothing. A prickle of frustration, sharp and immediate, flared within him. He ascended the grand iron staircase, his footsteps heavy on the worn treads, and tried from his bedroom. Still nothing. The thought of driving into the nearest village, a half-hour journey over unpaved roads, felt monumental, an insurmountable task. He told himself it was the research, the late nights, the constant mental strain. Yet, the reluctance felt deeper, a subtle, insistent pull keeping him tethered to the manor. Days blurred into a seamless tapestry of research and increasing lethargy. Marcus found himself neglecting simple routines. His beard grew, a rough stubble that scratched at his jaw. His clothes, once neatly pressed, became a uniform of rumpled comfort. Meals were forgotten or consisted of whatever was immediately accessible in the pantry. Dry biscuits, stale bread. The initial urgency to document, to analyze, to understand still flickered, but it was now interspersed with long periods of vacant staring, his gaze lost in the intricate patterns of the manor's aging wallpaper or the dust motes dancing in the shafts of light. The house, he realized, was not just a repository of history. It was a living, breathing entity. He began to perceive its possessiveness. When he contemplated leaving, even for a short walk into the overgrown gardens, the air in the manor seemed to thicken, pressing against him, a subtle weight on his chest. A faint, almost imperceptible hum resonated through the ancient stones, a low thrumming that seemed to vibrate in his very bones. It wasn't unpleasant, not exactly. This strange solace, however, was accompanied by a subtle draining of his energy, his will. He decided, with a sudden, inexplicable surge of his former determination, that he would leave. He would drive to the village, procure supplies, and more importantly, find a working telephone line. He retrieved his car keys, the cold metal feeling alien in his palm. The drive was uneventful, a blur of overgrown hedgerows and winding lanes. He reached the small, sleepy village, its handful of cottages clustered around a single, dormant main street. His destination was the general store, but as he drove past, his gaze was inexplicably drawn to a dilapidated structure on the edge of town. It was the old cinema. Its Art Deco facade, once grand, was now peeling, a ghost of its former glory. The marquee, tilted and rusting, still bore faint traces of faded letters, illegible now, like forgotten dreams. A single, broken window stared out like a vacant eye. He pulled his car over, the engine ticking as it cooled. He knew nothing of this place, had no reason to stop. Yet, a powerful, almost magnetic pull held him. It wasn't curiosity that held him, but something deeper, a sense of obligation, as if the manor had directed him here. He should be going to the store, making that call. But the old cinema, decaying and forgotten, held his attention with an almost hypnotic grip. The thought of navigating human interaction, of explaining his prolonged absence to the storekeeper, felt utterly draining. He started the car, the engine turning over with a reluctant groan. He didn't go to the store. He turned the vehicle around, away from the village, and drove back toward the manor. The decision felt less like a choice and more like an inevitability, a preordained return. He was home. He neglected to unpack his bag, or even to properly close the front door. He felt he understood the terror, not as a historian analyzing a document, but as an inheritor of a shared burden. This was a new sensation, unsettling in its intimacy. He pushed the journal away, the leather creaking softly against the polished wood. The air in his study felt heavy, laden with the scent of aged paper, dust, and something else, a faint, metallic tang, like old blood or forgotten iron. He stood, intending to stretch, to clear his mind with a walk through the familiar corridors. But the corridor outside his study was not precisely familiar. The ornate tapestry that usually hung on the left wall, depicting a hunting scene, was gone. Marcus blinked, a slow, deliberate action. He had walked this path dozens of times. He was certain of the tapestry. He reached out, his fingertips brushing the rough canvas of a portrait, his brow furrowed. Had he simply overlooked them? No, the tapestry had been a distinctive feature, a splash of muted color in the otherwise somber hallway. He turned, intending to re-enter his study, but the door was no longer directly behind him. He pressed his palm against the smooth, unyielding surface. No seam, no handle, no lock, just solid wood. He was certain he had just exited the room. His mind, usually a precise instrument, felt suddenly like a poorly tuned piano hitting sour notes. He took a deep breath, the metallic scent in the air suddenly more pronounced. This was illogical. He was tired, perhaps hallucinating from lack of sleep and the stress of the journal. He would retrace his steps, find another route. He walked forward, the hallway stretching out before him, seemingly longer than he remembered. He turned a corner he didn't recall existing, then another. He tried to remember the manor's layout, picturing the architectural plans he had studied, but the mental map wavered, lines blurring, rooms shifting positions. It was as if the house itself was reorganizing its internal organs around him. A memory surfaced, unbidden, of a conversation he'd had with a colleague about a structural anomaly in an ancient abbey, a section that seemed to defy known architectural principles. But this was different. This was not an anomaly. This was active, deliberate change. A faint, sweet scent, like old popcorn and dust, emanated from beneath it. Curiosity, or perhaps a desperate need for a fixed point, propelled him to push it open. The door swung inward with a groan that seemed to reverberate through the floorboards. It was an old cinema. Rows of velvet upholstered seats, many ripped and spilling their horsehair stuffing, stretched into the gloom, facing a screen that was a vast, gray expanse, stained and faded. A projector sat silent in a booth high above, its lens like a cyclopean eye. Cobwebs draped like spectral curtains from the ceiling, catching the slivers of light that pierced the grimy skylights. Marcus stepped inside, the sole of his boot crunching on something small and brittle. He bent down. It was a fragment of a dried rose petal, deep crimson, almost black. He ran his hand over the back of a seat. The velvet was surprisingly soft, despite its age. He closed his eyes, and for a fleeting moment, he saw it. A young woman, laughing, her hand in that of a man, their faces illuminated by the flickering light from the screen. He opened his eyes abruptly, the vision dissipating like smoke. That wasn't his memory. He had never been in this old cinema before. Whose memory was it? Was it the journal writer's or someone else's? He stumbled back, his breath catching in his throat. He tried to recall his own life, his own distinct memories. His childhood home, the university library, the smell of old parchment, the taste of his morning coffee. But these memories felt distant, like scenes from a film he had merely watched, not lived. He repeated it, louder, trying to anchor himself. Marcus, he was no longer merely lost in the house. He was becoming lost to the house, his own mind a labyrinthine extension of its malevolent will. It was an accusation, a warning, a chilling echo from a mind that had recognized its own disintegration. The phrase suggested a process, a slow erosion, not a sudden break. This wasn't merely a haunting, it was a consumption. His gaze drifted to a shelf of local history books, specifically to a slim volume on the area's forgotten businesses. An entry, previously dismissed as irrelevant, now snagged his attention. The Grand Regal Picture House, a local hub notorious for its abrupt closure in 1947 following a series of incidents. Proprietor, Mr. Elias Thorne, reportedly vanished. Thorne, the name stirred a faint recollection, a fleeting mention in one of the manor's earlier inventories, perhaps as a distant relative or an associate of a previous owner. The abrupt closure and vanishing proprietor seemed less coincidental now. A cold certainty settled in Marcus. The incident and Thorne's disappearance, coupled with the manor's pattern of absorbing its inhabitants, demanded investigation. He needed to see if the old cinema held any overlooked fragments of the past, any records that had been too mundane for the manor's more dramatic archives. He gathered his coat, the fabric feeling heavy and unresponsive in his hands. The old cinema stood on the edge of town, a skeletal structure of crumbling brick and faded grandeur. Its marquee, stripped of its letters, resembled a gaping mouth. Weeds clawed at the cracked pavement leading to the heavy, chained doors. A faint, acrid smell of mildew and decay wafted from within, a scent that seemed to cling to the very air around the building. Marcus pried open a boarded-up side entrance, splinters biting at his gloves. Dust motes danced in the light, thick as snow in the projector's beam. The air was heavy, tasting of stale popcorn, forgotten dreams, and the slow rot of time. Row upon row of velvet seats, once plush, now sagged like deflated lungs, their fabric torn, revealing yellowed foam. The screen at the front was a vast, gray canvas, scarred with water stains and peeling paint, a mirror of forgotten narratives. He moved through the silent space, his footsteps echoing unnervingly. The projector booth, high above, drew him like a morbid beacon. Up a narrow, creaking staircase he went, each step groaning under his weight. The booth was a mausoleum of obsolete technology. A hulking projector, its lens opaque with dust, stood sentinel over stacks of brittle film reels. The air here was even thicker, laced with the sharp, chemical tang of decaying celluloid. On a small, grimy desk, beneath a layer of fine dust, lay a stack of ledger books and a single, leather-bound diary. Elias Thorne's. Marcus opened the diary. The handwriting was neat, precise, then slowly deteriorated into a frantic scrawl. Thorne had meticulously documented the strange occurrences, patrons complaining of inexplicable memory lapses after seeing films, the projectionist's increasing confusion, the gradual fading of the colors on the screen itself. The images drain away. An entry from 1946 read, leaving only the gray, and the people they leave a piece of themselves here, a vitality, a spark. Later entries became more desperate. It hungers, not for the light, but for what the light illuminates. It feeds on the seeing, the remembering. The house Blackwood Manor, it draws from the world, siphoning the essence of life and memory. It grows stronger. Marcus's breath hitch. Thorne, too, had seen the pattern. He had witnessed the drain, the slow, insidious consumption. The incidents were not random events. They were the manor's tendrils reaching out, absorbing life force through the shared experience of the cinema. He found an old film reel, still spooled, labeled Blackwood Manor, 1938. With a desperate urgency, Marcus managed to power on the ancient projector. The whirring mechanism coughed to life, grinding and clicking. The film flickered into life. A black and white home movie. Initial scenes showed a vibrant family, laughing on the manor's lawn, their faces clear, their movements lively. But as the film progressed, a subtle shift occurred. The faces seemed to lose definition, their smiles becoming vacant, their movements sluggish. The colors, even in monochrome, seemed to dim, the contrast softening as if the very light had been leached from the images. A woman, her face once bright, sat in a drawing room staring blankly at the camera. Her memory, her essence, had been consumed. The film ended abruptly, dissolving into static and then blackness. The pieces clicked into place with horrifying precision. The conscious awareness of decline in the journal, Thorne's desperate entries, the draining images on the film reel, the disappearances, the unraveling minds, it was all the same pattern. Blackwood Manor was not merely haunted. It was a malevolent, sentient entity. It wasn't a passive observer of tragedy. It was the architect of it. It consumed the memories, the sanity, the very life force of its inhabitants, growing stronger, more voracious with each victim. The house was a predator, and its prey were those who dared to live within its walls. He was not just investigating a historical mystery. He was caught in a living, breathing trap. The subtle shifts in his own memory, the fleeting moments of disorientation, the creeping sense of something vital being siphoned away, they were not symptoms of stress or exhaustion. They were the early stages of being consumed. He was its current, preferred meal. The final scrawled words from the journal entries clawed at Marcus, a hook in the fog of his mind. It hungers. It feeds on the seeing, the remembering. The house Blackwood Manor grows stronger. A visceral dread, sharp and cold, pierced through the layers of spectral haze that had settled over his thoughts. This was not the familiar, insidious creeping numbness, but a jolt, a horrifying clarity. The house fed on perception, on consciousness itself. His own memories, his carefully catalogued history, his very awareness were the fuel. He was not merely a tenant, but a slow, agonizing meal. A flicker of resistance, raw and desperate, ignited within him. He had to fight, not for escape, not for survival, but for the cessation of this monstrous consumption. If it fed on memory, perhaps there was a way to starve it, to sever the connection. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from a sudden, fierce determination. He pushed himself from the reading chair, the leather groaning in protest as if the house itself resented his movement. The air in the study thickened, pressing in, laden with the scent of dust and something metallic, like old blood. Shadows deepened in the corners, coiling, watching. He felt eyes on him, countless unseen eyes, each one a part of the house, probing his intentions. A half-forgotten conversation, a fragmented snippet from a local villager's ramblings about old town records, resurfaced. Something about a place where the oldest stories were kept, away from the manor's reach, a place that had outlived its purpose. A place called the Old Cinema. It had been mentioned as a kind of unofficial archive after the town hall fire decades ago, a temporary storage for things people didn't know what to do with before they were eventually lost or moved. A long shot, a desperate gamble, but the idea pulsed with a strange, compelling logic. Perhaps what was hidden in a place of public gathering, yet forgotten, held a secret. The manor's influence was a suffocating shroud, but his focus sharpened, narrowing to a single point. The old cinema. He navigated the familiar, yet increasingly distorted hallways, each step a battle against the subtle pull that tried to anchor him, to lull his back into passive acceptance. The tapestries seemed to writhe, the portrait's eyes followed him, and the very floorboard beneath his feet groaned as if in protest. Outside, the air was still and heavy, the sky a bruised purple. The path to the village, usually a short walk, felt interminable. Trees along the lane seemed to lean in, their branches like skeletal fingers. The old cinema stood on the edge of the village, a hulking, decaying structure of brick and peeling paint. Its marquee, rusted and broken, still held a few faded letters. Grand Picture House. A faint, sickly sweet smell, like stale popcorn mixed with damp rot, hung in the air. Marcus pushed through the gap, stepping into the musty gloom. The air was thick with decades of forgotten breath and settled dust. The floor was littered with debris, Broken glass, fallen plaster, empty concession wrappers from a forgotten era. Every sound echoed, magnifying his own ragged breathing. The house's influence felt weaker here, a dull throb rather than a piercing ache, but it was still present, a subtle pressure on his temples. He moved through the auditorium, his gaze sweeping over the wreckage. Where would anything be hidden? Not in the public view. He made his way backstage, past tattered curtains and dusty props, towards what would have been the manager's office. The door hung off its hinges. Inside, a small, cramped room dominated by a heavy, ornate desk. Drawers hung open, spilling ledgers and yellowed papers. This was a fool's errand. The house was too pervasive, too old. Then his hand snagged on something behind the desk. Not a drawer, but a loose panel in the wall, cleverly disguised by a faded, framed playbill. His heart hammered against his ribs. He pried it open, revealing a narrow recess. Inside, nestled amongst cobwebs, lay a small, lead-lined wooden box, surprisingly heavy. He pulled it out, his fingers fumbling with the tarnished clasp. It opened with a soft click, revealing not documents, but a single, ancient-looking object. Intricate, swirling symbols were carved into its surface, foreign and unsettling. Wrapped around it was a single sheet of parchment, brittle with age, covered in cramped, meticulous script that seemed to shift and blur under his gaze. He unfolded it carefully. The script, though archaic, slowly resolved itself into a language he recognized, albeit barely, as an older form of Latin. He squinted, the words swimming, but one phrase, repeated, stood out. Quisitas domus. Oblivio animi. Salus lumen frangitor. Blindness of the house. Forgetting of the spirit. Only light breaks. The sphere, the ritual, the words. It was a method not of destruction, but of severing, of unseeing. But the cost of Livio animi, forgetting of the spirit, he understood with a sickening certainty. Marcus clutched the stone sphere, its surface cool against his palm. The weight of it was immense, not just physical, but existential. He had found his answer, his desperate chance. It was terrifying, a path that led not to victory, but to a different kind of oblivion. But it was a choice, a final act of resistance. A visceral dread, sharp and cold, pierced through the layers of spectral haze that had settled over his thoughts. The house fed on perception, on consciousness itself. The realization solidified Marcus's resolve. He would not be consumed. He would not become another forgotten whisperer in these decaying halls. He would fight. His first attempt to navigate the grand staircase was met with an immediate, jarring resistance. The heavy oak banister, which had felt solid moments before, shimmered, its polished surface distorting. Marcus reached for it, his fingers passing through what felt like an icy, viscous film before connecting with the cold, hard wood beneath. He recoiled, a shiver tracing its way down his spine. This was new. The house was no longer merely influencing, it was actively impeding. He tried a different route, heading towards the library, hoping to find some obscure text, some forgotten diary entry that might hint at a weakness. The corridor leading to it, a familiar path he had tried countless times, began to narrow. The ornate wallpaper on either side seemed to bulge inwards, the pattern stretching and twisting into grotesque, leering faces. The air grew thick, pressing in on him, making each breath a conscious effort. He pushed forward, his shoulder brushing against the phantom walls, the sensation like moving through a dense, invisible web. The passage, impossibly, became too tight. He was forced to turn back, the path behind him now also shrinking, threatening to crush him. He squeezed his eyes shut, forcing himself to breathe, to remember the physical reality of the manor. When he opened them, the corridor was still narrow, but passable. The house had tested him, and he had nearly buckled. He found himself in the east wing, a section he rarely visited. A low, guttural moan echoed from the walls, not quite sound, not quite thought, but a palpable vibration that resonated in his chest. He hesitated, then pushed through. The air was heady with the scent of dust, stale popcorn, and something else, a cloying, metallic tang that clung to the back of his throat. Overhead, the once grand ceiling was a patchwork of crumbling plaster and exposed laths. Tattered velvet curtains, the color of dried blood, framed a doorway that promised the main auditorium. Marcus felt a horrifying certainty. This was not a real place, not truly outside the manor. This was an extension, a trap woven from his own perceptions. A low, rhythmic thump-thump-thump emanated from beyond the curtains, like an ancient projector struggling to turn. He moved towards it, his boots crunching on scattered debris and something glassy that shattered underfoot. The screen, vast and stained, was alive. Then, the images shifted. The screen showed the manor, but not as he knew it. It showed its victims. A woman, her face etched with despair, struggling against unseen bonds. And then, a figure coalesced from the flickering light, standing directly in front of the screen. It was tall, gaunt, its form wavering like heat haze. Its clothes were archaic, its features indistinct, but its gaze, though unseen, felt like a physical weight pressing down on Marcus. It raised a hand, long, skeletal fingers pointing directly at him. It was his own voice, distorted, echoing his most private thoughts, his deepest fears. "You are next." The house was not just showing him his memories. It was trying to redefine them, to twist them into weapons against him. It wasn't merely absorbing his consciousness. It was actively attempting to break his will, to shatter his sense of self. The spectral figure stepped forward, its form solidifying, its eyes, now visible, burning with a malevolent, ancient hunger. It was the manor's hunger made manifest. He stood his ground, his breath catching in his throat. This was the final battle, not for his life, but for his very identity. The house had shown its true face, a sentient predator that devoured not flesh, but the essence of being. He understood now. The spectral figures, the visions, the shifting architecture, these were all extensions of its will, its desperate attempts to maintain its hold, to ensure his complete, utter absorption. The figure lunged, its form dissolving into a rush of cold air and shadow. Marcus felt a violent shove, a force that sent him stumbling backward, catching himself on a row of decaying cinema seats. He knew, with an absolute certainty, that if he gave in now, he would become just another flicker on the screen, another forgotten memory for the house to feast upon. He would not. He would find a way to sever its parasitic hold, even if it meant tearing his own mind apart in the process. A cold, sharp pain bloomed behind Marcus's eyes, a persistent throb that resonated with the house's insidious whispers. He saw his mother's face, not in the gentle light of a forgotten afternoon, but contorted in a silent scream, her eyes wide with an accusation he couldn't decipher. But Marcus pushed back. He clutched the heavy, leather-bound journal the estate manager's father's to his chest, its brittle pages a tangible anchor against the encroaching phantom reality. His research had been a desperate scramble, a race against the house's relentless consumption, its mouth, its digestive tract for the fragments of human experience it craved. The path to this projection room was not straightforward. The manor itself seemed to writhe, its internal geography shifting to impede him. Corridors elongated, their wallpaper peeling in patterns that resembled weeping faces. Doors he had known to lead to the library now opened onto unfamiliar, dust-choked stairwells descending into absolute blackness. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of decay and ozone, like the aftermath of a storm that had never truly broken. Each step was a deliberate act of defiance against the psychological assault, his mind a fortress under siege. He felt the house's frustration, a low, guttural vibration that hummed through the floorboards and up into his bones. It wanted him to surrender, to become another forgotten echo in its vast, hungry maw. He found it eventually, not through a grand archway, but behind a nondescript, iron-banded door in a forgotten wing, tucked away as if the house itself wished to hide its most intimate secret. He pushed it open, the hinges groaning in protest, a sound like a tortured sigh. Beyond lay the old cinema. It was not grand, nor was it particularly well preserved. It was a relic, a testament to a forgotten era of the manor's existence. Rows of velvet-covered seats, now moth-eaten and collapsed in places, faced a vast, stained screen. The air was stagnant, heady with the cloying scent of mildew and stale popcorn, an absurd detail that sharpened the unsettling reality. He moved slowly down the central aisle, his boots crunching softly on discarded wrappers and what felt like dry, brittle film strips. But it was the projection booth at the back that drew his gaze. Inside the booth, the air was even heavier, charged with an almost palpable tension. A colossal, antique film projector dominated the space, its brass mechanisms tarnished, its massive lenses staring blankly at the screen below. It was connected to a series of thick, braided cables that snaked across the floor and disappeared into a gaping hole in the wall, as if feeding directly into the house's foundations. This was it, the core, the house's true heart, its mechanism for consuming and replaying the lives it had absorbed. He saw the film reels, not standard celluloid, but spools woven from what looked like strands of human hair, intertwined with dried, papery skin, and something else, something shimmering and iridescent, like solidified regret. The groundskeeper's notes had mentioned that the house processed these memories, twisting them, refining them, until they became pure sustenance. The house was not merely haunted, it was the haunting, an active, malevolent consciousness that ran on the projected sorrows and fears of its victims. Marcus's plan, crude and desperate, was to overload it, to sever its connection, to jam its gears, to break the projector's ability to process and consume. He had brought with him an old, heavy iron wrench from the manor's cellar, its head pitted with rust. It felt inadequate, a blunt instrument against an ethereal, sentient force, but it was all he had. As he reached for the projector's main drive shaft, a low hum began to emanate from the machine. On the screen below, images flickered into existence, not his own memories this time, but a rapid-fire montage of suffering. A woman screaming silently, her hands pressed against her head. A man, eyes wide with despair, slowly fading into the wallpaper. The house was fighting back, attacking attempting to drown him in the accumulated anguish of centuries. The projector whirred faster, its hum rising to a shriek that vibrated through Marcus's teeth. The old cinema itself seemed to groan, the seats below him creaking in unison, as if a spectral audience had suddenly materialized, their unseen gazes fixed on him. The air grew heavy, pressing down, making it difficult to breathe. His resolve wavered, a thin thread against the overwhelming tide of despair. Now, the cold, sharp pain behind Marcus's eyes intensified, a relentless throb that echoed the house's insidious whispers. He saw his childhood home, not as a haven, but a decaying cage, its walls breathing, its shadows reaching. The house was not just taking, it was corrupting. A desperate instinct, a sliver of the old Marcus ignited within him. He needed a sanctuary, a place where his mind could anchor, even if only for a moment. His thoughts, fragmented and frayed, latched onto a memory, a specific, isolated space he hadn't thought of in decades. The old cinema from his youth. He clung to it, a mental shield against the encroaching chaos. The air around him thickened, growing heavy with the scent of stale popcorn and ancient dust. He opened his eyes, or perhaps merely perceived, that he was no longer in the grand hall of the manor. He stood in the narrow aisle of an old cinema. The velvet seats, once a vibrant crimson, were now faded to a bruised purple, torn and stained. The air was cool, carrying the faint metallic tang of disuse. This was not a physical place he had walked to. It was a manifestation, a pocket of memory the house had allowed him to project, perhaps as a final, cruel stage for his dissolution. Marcus's breath hitched. Then, the screen flickered. A hazy, sepia-toned image appeared. It was a scene from his past, an ordinary afternoon in his university library, the clatter of keyboards, the rustle of pages. But as he watched, the image began to distort. The faces of his colleagues blurred, their features elongating into caricatures of greed or indifference. The books on the shelves melted into indistinguishable smears of color. The comfortable hum of the library became the same guttural vibration he felt now. A wave of nausea washed over him. The house wasn't just showing him his memories, it was showing him its version of them. It was feeding, not on the raw data, but on the emotional residue of his past, twisting it, making it unrecognizable, indigestible. He felt a desperate urge to look away, but his gaze was fixed, his muscles locked. He was an unwilling audience to his own undoing. He had to break the connection, to disrupt the projection. This was the house's illusion, its trap. If he could find the source, the projector, perhaps he could cut the feed. The hum intensified, filling the entire space, rattling his teeth. The images on the screen accelerated, a chaotic montage of his life, warped and hideous. His mother's smile, twisting into a rictus of despair. Each distorted memory was a tiny shard tearing at his sanity. He felt the edges of his own identity fraying, his sense of Marcus becoming porous, permeable. He forced himself to move, pushing past the rows of seats, his feet sinking slightly into the threadbare carpet. That was it. That had to be the nexus. As he reached the back of the cinema, the screen exploded with a blinding white light, accompanied by a shriek that ripped through his eardrums. He clapped his hands over his ears, but the sound was inside him, vibrating in his bones. When the light subsided, the screen was no longer showing his memories. This was it. This was the house's true form, or at least a glimpse of its digestive core. It was not just absorbing, it was processing. And he was next. The house didn't just consume and destroy, it integrated. It became the sum of all it devoured, a sentient archive, a living memory palace built from the shattered remnants of countless souls. His memories, his very self, would not be lost. They would become part of it, forever replayed, forever twisted, fuel for its eternal, insidious existence. The old cinema was not a stage for his ending, but a preview of his absorption, a glimpse into the endless loop of fragmented consciousness he would become. He felt a profound exhaustion, a weariness that went beyond the physical. His determination wavered, threatened by the sheer, crushing weight of the house's ancient, insatiable hunger. He could fight, but what was there to fight? A consciousness so vast it made his own seem like a single, flickering candle. He stood transfixed, the vortex on the screen pulling at him, not physically, but with an irresistible, mental suction. He felt his thoughts, his feelings, his very sense of Marcus, stretching, thinning like taffy pulled beyond its limit. He could resist, futilely, until he shattered into a million pieces. Or he could yield. A strange calm began to settle over him, a numb surrender. The pain behind his eyes softened, replaced by a dull ache, then a quiet thrum. He closed his eyes, and in that final moment, he felt not a tearing, but a dissolving. A blending. He was no longer Marcus, the historian, the skeptic. He was a sensation, a memory, a fragment of thought, joining countless others in the swirling, endless reel projected onto the eternal screen of the house. The hum continued, a low, resonant drone, now utterly silent, utterly complete. The old cinema, empty once more, held only the echoes of a life absorbed, a story now part of the house's own, unending narrative.